So I met Svend Erik at the Academia Europaea many years ago. I don't know how many years ago, but since then we were sitting in the board of this European international, trans-European institution or European international organization. Svend Erik is now emeritus. He's an emeritus professor of comparative literature at the University of Aarhus, which is in Denmark. You should know about it. Next to Copenhagen, that's the second largest university of Denmark, or probably the largest one.
No, it's just the best.
Just the best university. I visited actually Aarhus, and it's a very fascinating place because it's the center of a whole province in Denmark. And the university is responsible for everything. It has theaters, it has orchestra, it has museums, technology transfer center. So it's a very unique constellation of many things. So the university function is not only teaching students, but basically organizing the community life in the whole Aarhus area.
Yeah, pretty much whole of Denmark, actually.
You whole Denmark, probably,
yeah,
pretty much.
Yeah,
so Svend Erik did his research originally in semiotics, language philosophy, history of literature, philosophy and literature, and recently about the impact of society on literature or impact of literature on society. And I think you will talk about the sort of impact of literature in society in different cultures, East and West.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation and thank you for staying so long. Please stay on until Andy's talk as well. The topic of this seminar is Parallelisms Beyond Boundaries, and when it comes to cultural studies, you can kind of have two ways of thinking about that. One has to do with comparative cultural studies, where you take one culture and you kind of give it a profile by comparing it beyond its limits with other cultures. That's one approach. The other approach is different. That is more case-based, as Anne said this morning, namely what happens in the culture when events of an enormity takes place, which challenges the cohesion and thereby makes visible the limits of that culture, where in a sense those are events which the culture cannot really handle in its usual ways. It has to go beyond its limits to take care of that. And those are the things I would be working with. And it will happen in this type of program here. I have 3 preliminaries first. Actually 4, because the first one is I will not use the word brain because I might make gross mistakes when I go into that field, but I hope it's understandable across the disciplines here. The other preliminaries, and then I will go to a couple of photos which I would like you to keep in mind throughout my talk. I will return to it, and then I will say something about cultural encounters and cultural conflicts, and then I will come to some basic notions in historical context, which is part of my argument, and then I will end with a novel. Had I been in a seminar for literary studies, I would have been starting with the novel on fall, but I think for an interdisciplinary discussion, I think, or my experience is that it's best to start to develop some kind of notions, concepts, directions, arguments, and so on. So that's the way it goes. The first of the 3 preliminaries had to do with this parallelism notion, that we go from an event where a culture kind of has, its limits will be challenged and its center will be challenged. And you can have 2 approaches to studies of individual culture, not for cultural studies as such. One which I will call the centralized approach, where you kind of give a description of the intrinsic features, the most essential ones, which give you a kind of image of the totality of the cohesiveness of a culture. This is very important because when we want to know about other cultures and religions, we go to handbooks, and it's typically kind of things which goes into a handbook of world religions, a handbook of world cultures, and so on. And this is a very useful piece of information, and it's very harmful to the actual study of cultures because there is a tacit presupposition behind it, namely that if that way of describing cultures corresponds to the actual life of cultures, then we have the presupposition that culture stands alone. So this description does not tell how cultures work, because all cultures work and have their essential features defined by an actual interchange, exchange, interaction with other cultures or different levels of cultures. So in a sense, the description you have from a centralized perspective is lying a bit, because it very often kind of gives the image of that it is a cohesiveness that defines a culture. It is not. It is the power of a culture to exchange and take in and give away things, which then means that inside such a culture there will always be contradictions. It's part of the essential nature of a culture that it will have internal contradictions. And those are the ones we have to capture in order to understand not only that cultures have exchange with each other as a kind of derivative of their essential cohesiveness, but it is the very life of culture. It's necessary for cultures to have these kind of exchange and be able to live with those very different types and different levels of contradictions. And that nature of culture, to me, is revealed when we study cultures through cases of extreme challenges of their limits, because that's where their capacity to renovate themselves, renew themselves by exchanging and take in new experiences in order to cope with that. So that will be something else. That will what I will call the liminal approach to study of culture, where you start by where are the limits? How are the limits of that culture? How does it become visible? How can we see it in a way so we can understand the life of that culture, not just its ideal structure? And I mean, it's not necessary to say that in today's, at least in Europe, nationalistic take on the national cultures, this is being taken to be the real life of an ideal life of a culture, not the exchange. So there's also, I think, ideological and political and historical reasons to develop this approach into a kind of methodology and theory for the study of literature to dismantle that very dangerous nationalistic move we have in Europe. And that's the point is then that this dynamical overlap of cultures are emphasized and made visible when we have experiences of radical transgressions of what belongs to a culture. So that's one preliminary. The second preliminary has to do with a set of pictures I will show in a little while, but I see here that I have noted also that my third point, before I come to the photos, has this kind of east-west. So let me just, I have a very simple take on that. Say the east-west dichotomy, that's a cultural mapping of the world which is translated into spatial and geographical terms. And that's a very important point, because being a cultural mapping and not a spatial mapping, but a cultural mapping translated into a spatial mapping, it means that this spatial mapping does not cover space in the first place, but it's a mechanism which have two functions. One is selective, because by giving that dichotomy high priority, we leave out Africa and South America and what have we. So it is selective translation of cultural values onto space and geography. And the second is, of course, that it is a process of evaluation, where gives cultures position from where they can evaluate the others. And one of the reasons, I think, that the East-West has been such a strong, what shall I call it, cliche in international discussion about world cultures, and so is that it gave an equal value to both sides. The East could define itself in positive terms by looking to the West and the other way around, whereas the cultural mapping on colonial terms, for instance in Africa, did not give that possibility. Even if there were attempts to make a pan-African movement in the States around 1900, it never gained a status where it gave an identity from which the African countries could evaluate themselves in positive terms. But the East-West dichotomy have had that nature. So it's a kind of historical fact that this dichotomy became so basic and it has been renewed over time here. But behind that, there's also a kind of tacit assumption, namely that it's a valid way of making a cultural mapping of the world in dichotomies, which you can place spatially apart. And that is, of course, a very dangerous approach, although it has been functioning for years, because, as we just heard in the other speak by Helena, because most of the cultural settings or spaces or social communities where it's relevant to discuss the encounter and exchange of different cultures, those are globalized places, like multicultural settings, like cities in the first place, but now with the flows of migration of various types. Of course, most places will be multicultural or exist on multicultural conditions. So it means that this dichotomy, unless we can retranslate it in another spatial configuration, namely on places which before did not have that kind of cultural makeup, then this type of cultural mapping becomes invalid and obsolete, which I think the East-West is, because as in Singapore you have English Mandarin, that's what we heard about. This is a place where this is inside the place. It's not in two different places. And that's even in homogeneous Denmark, where we are supposed to be so happy. That's part of our everyday life. It is that way. So I think that by using the term cultural mapping, and in particular the word translation, we hit on how cultural history and cultures work in history. They namely work always by complicated processes of translation. Like you translate from one level of culture to another, you translate from everyday experience to value system and so on and so forth. So translation is the type of exchange cultures have on various levels. Of course, the basic level would be the semiotic translations between languages, between one media language and other medias like visuality, between bodies and so on and so forth. All those translations mechanisms which over the last 25 years have been kind of developed in translation studies from being a kind of technical discipline dealing with how you go from English to Mandarin and so on, how you translate and enlarge the notion of translation to understand that this is the basic mechanism of cultures, and then you have to re-embed verbal or linguistic translation into that wider context, so that translation is not, which is often the case, seen as something we have an original language or formulation, and then we go into another language, but we can't say it becomes not as good as in the original language. That's an entirely misunderstanding of the function of translation, because translation is a way in which cultures meet each other with all the misunderstandings which is entailed in it, but it is a culturally productive function. It's not going from one level which is good and then down the scale and so on. And most of us in here are like me. I mean, I speak Danish in several languages, English, broken English being one of them, and that's the way we communicate, and I will probably make a host of grammatical errors and maybe also use wrong terms now and then, but then we have conversation to clear it up. You said something there, I didn't understand it, and then I try to reformulate it and so on and so forth. So translation is an active cultural way of changing cultures, exchanging cultures between cultures, producing exchange between cultures. It is not a way of giving a reduced meaning. So, said that, then I come to the photos I want to show you. That's of the return of hostages. And of course, taking hostages is a transgressive action in relation to it. That's not everyday practice in a culture. And if hostages are taken during war, we are within the realm of crimes of war, maybe crimes against humanity. And that will be an occasion where value systems in different cultures are challenged, both those who take hostages and the others. And in particular, when the hostages return. Do they return like in the good old stories when the hero goes out and fights, he comes back, and then everything is just happiness. Do they go back to a good life? And here are the Hashidis coming back from Iran in 1979, where I think there were about 40 people from the American embassy, which was taken by young rebels for 1.5 years in Iran. And here are how they are received in the States, and how the Jubilee with the victory sign, although everybody knows it was not a victory. And here they are received with the jubilation by all people. And we also know that in Iran, those who are the young guys who are taking them as hostages, the captivators, were also received and celebrated as heroes. So here we have two different cultural systems dealing with a transgressive act. It was during a revolution in Iran in such a way that this act is integrated in the standard cultural value system, and in that way confirming the dichotomy between the two cultures. There was no exchange here. So there were heroes on both sides, which was against reality but not against the cultural evaluation. And as we know, cultures works positively based on mistakes and misunderstandings and errors, but they work very well and have done that for many years. So the positive role, proactive role of mistakes is a very good way of understanding what culture does, where science can come and say, this is not true, this is not true. But it is very hard to get the message across, as we have also heard. Well, the second, and there's of course an East-West conflict here between Iran and the States, between a Muslim revolution and the, well, secular Christian American state. Then we have ISIS hostages coming back to Turkey in 2014. There were two groups. One was the diplomats taking hostages just recently, and then was a group of truck drivers, so it was 80 persons here. They are coming back also to Turkey, being received by family and friends and government and what have we. We have the same picture here, but there's a difference, because something had to be, the government had to be completely silent about. That did they negotiate with the terrorists or did they not? So part of this jubilation presupposes there's something in hidden. So this is not an situation which this culture can deal with up front, because it's part of a basic principle, it's part of the international status of Turkey, which is very important for Erdogan and so on. So this jubilation here hides a lot of things which did take place on the official level, although it was not said. And it, of course, confirmed the opposition between Turkey here as a representative, as another victim of ISIS online with the Western countries. The third picture is entirely different, and for a Western eye like mine, completely confusing. This is from 2007, when a group of Korean NGOs and volunteers went to Afghanistan to do charity work. And they were taken hostage by the Taliban. Some of you may remember the story. And 2 were killed. And then they came back to Korea. And this is from the airport. This is from the airport as well. They belong to a small Christian minority in South Korea, namely the Presbyterian. They are doing something entirely different. They are making excuses. The government is doing the same as here. We did not negotiate. That's absolutely impossible. We cannot do that in South Korea. For me, this is absolutely, I had to read a couple of articles about it and see what happened here. But they excused. And this scene we saw in the talk before about the taxi driver referring to friends and family and so on really applies here. Because what happened was that they excused that they had put shame on the family and on the government because they had publicly been forced to show that South Koreans did something stupid, were not courageous, and that the government had great difficulties in how explain we didn't negotiate, but there was a written contract, which was not a negotiation, we didn't give in and so on. So that was, of course, completely political lingo formulated kind of result here. So that was an example of how a different types of meeting East and West, which is very complicated, because these people come from a country where they are a Christian minority and where you have a Buddhist majority. And Buddhists do not do what the Taliban accused them for, namely, they tried to convert the Muslims, which is an unforgivable sin among the Muslims, the shirk. But Buddhism has no missionaries. You can be a Buddhist or you don't. I mean, it's up to you. Whereas Christians, of course, they would be suspected for having been missionaries because it's part of Christianity that you go out and convert people just like you do in Islam. But they don't. So it's not just Christian group. And inside Korea, when they came back, of course, it was the local sense of honor and shame, which is so deeply ingrained, framed by Buddhism within Korea, that defined how they were to be received. So here it's clearly, from those pictures, it was the Iranians and the ISIS who commit the unforgivable act, and now we have saved people to come back. But here, it was not Taliban. Taliban are bastards. They did what you could expect them to do if you're so stupid as going to Afghanistan. So it's you are guilty. You have committed the unforgivable, namely forcing us to lose face. That was the story you had in the newspapers. The families went out making excuse to the Korean people and to the government, and representatives of the hostages went out and so on and so forth. They are Presbyterian. And the Pope intervened, but on the basis of an entirely different value system, because he appealed to the Taliban about showing mercy, which would have added to the humiliation, of course. And different governments appealed in the name of universal human rights, which has no go here. So it is really an East-West meeting, which is very strange on many, many levels. Not just East-West, but on many, many levels in terms of politics, values, religions, and so on and so forth. And I will ask you to keep these pictures and these small stories in mind when I go on here. Because in the cases of radical transgression, you can debate whether this hostage situation is part of a larger discussion about unforgivable acts in times of war, terrorism, and so on. And what is important with them in the light of culture analysis on the limits of culture is that today there might not be more acts than there have been if you read the book of Samuel and the book of Kings in the Old Testament. I mean, this is just obnoxious what you read there. This is really crimes against humanity and everything you can imagine. But we know that it is part of an international media landscape. We cannot avoid knowing about it. It becomes a global concern, and UN and other international partners will have a meaning, and if your government does not voice a meaning on some of those things, we think they have to do it. So it becomes a part also of domestic cultures around the world, yet you need to take a stand to these kind of things, and we'll come back to the background. And when we have a radical transgression of a culture, it means that three important levels of norm systems which build up a culture and keep it together are challenged and transgressed. One might be challenged, I mean, the judiciary system with its definition of right and wrong will be transgressed whenever we have crimes and so on, and you can deal with it within the system. But if all three systems are kind of blown up, then that is, how do we cope with that? And we have at least those three systems. There might be more, but they are essential. The formal judiciary system where we have certain legal terms, right and wrong, and ethics, which is about ethical terms, of course. And then we have the very important one which has to do, I call it anthropology, namely right or wrong according to what is regarded as human and non-human. ISIS are doing, in many Western eyes, non-human acts, various killings, executions, and so on, whereas they are heroes on the other side. It's part of human courage, faithfulness, faith, and so on and so forth. So it is a debate about the limits of humanity which is involved when we have the radical transgressions, and here we are down with the very fundamental questions which defines a human culture, of course. In the cases where we do not have radical transgressions, we have certain tacit assumption, or you may even see tacit knowledge according to Ernst, which these norms kind are sandwiched between. And those are the metaphysical or religious formal principles we have, which we regard as universal in a culture. In many cultures, the majority of cultures around the world, those principles are still based on religion. In the Western world, and as it has been disseminated through colonialism and so on, it's mainly something which would be called universal human rights of sorts. I'll come back to that in a while. And the other level is what I will call the informal sense of justice, which you have in a culture, whereas the formal principles can live as principles, so to speak, decontextualized. And I'll come back to forgiveness as one of those which, through Christianity, has survived as a universal principle that can kind of travel the world without being contextualized, or rather without having its own context with it, but it can be contextualized in various places, as in various truth and reconciliation commissions we have. I heard in the news yesterday that Malaysia are thinking about having Sri Lanka is considering have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and there the Christian notion of forgiveness will, one way or the other, be part of the setup, regarded as something universal. Whereas the informal sense of justice is something else. It is heavily historically contextualized, and that's where, I'll come to a definition in a little while, that's where the acceptance of the results of transgressions and the working of the law, the ethics, and the anthropology is decided. And that acceptance is not always decided by clear arguments based on the principles, as we saw in the Korean case, because this honor and shame culture in Korea, which is derived, goes back to parts of Buddhism and so on and so forth, that's part of the sense of justice. And this, in many countries today, around the globalized world, the cultural conflicts are often between, when we have these kind of radical suggestions, between principles based on the universal principles foundation and the sense of justice which is carried on by tradition and culture and so on. One of the cases, I happened to be in India in 2012 when there was a girl who was gang raped in a bus in New Delhi. And it turned out in the newspapers afterwards it was just by accident that this case caught the attention, because there was numerous around in China. But that's another, which is like the earthquake of Lisbon, but which took the attention in the 18th century. But actually the earthquake of Messina was much more violent than the one in. But anyway, there are certain attractors of attention which can kind of carry the principal argument. And that was the case here. The interesting thing about that case was the arguments from the government based on universal principles of human rights built into the legal system which was set up by the British during the colonial times, and their various ratifications of human rights and so on, and amendments in the United States. And then the sense of justice, because what was going to happen to the boys, or 5 boys or 5 men? And lots of women groups, the official law system say they have to be sentenced, have to go to court. We may even redefine our system so we can have a death penalty. Whereas the large part of the everyday life set of normativity, which defines the sense of justice, relied on the caste system. This girl was a Dali, a lower caste, starting at the university. But the caste system, of course, has been, abandoned up here. And basically, it was her own fault, because how can a girl who is a Dali travel on her own in a bus in New Delhi and even go to university? And then she had a male co-student who followed her, but it was not her family. It was not her fiancé. How could she do that? She was basically invited for the rape to happen. I mean, around the world we have these type of arguments, of course, that women who are being raped are part of it themselves. But here it was not just a fancy excuse. It was deeply built into the traditional system that builds up the sense of justice in contrast to the other one. And this contrast becomes visible the moment we have radical transgressions. And there we have a way of looking at the limits of a system, of a culture, and the need for that culture to find ways of going beyond in order to find ways to cope with that. I will just give a brief definition here of sense of justice, because it's, I mean, in anthropology, and we had a historian here, I remember from the other day, yeah, in anthropology, when you talk about definitions, it's very different from formal definitions, which can be decontextualized outside the theory, which is the basic context of it. And Clifford Geertz, the anthropologist, gives two types of what he calls descriptions, which are used in the historical sciences, which is basically all humanities and part of social science, namely the thin description, which is a definition which you can make explicit in formal terms so that it becomes only dependent on the context of the theory that have set up the basics for it. Whereas the thick description, that's the description that always definition that will depend on the historical context. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And of course, the sense of justice is such a notion that only can be seen in the historical context. And being seen in the historical context, it also means that those definitions are dependent on human interaction. You cannot, as in neurology and so on, where you could look at on various neurons and cells and so on, kind of independent of the human subjects who are kind of interaction with this brain. When you go to thick description, the human interaction is at the basis. When you remove that, you don't get the answers you want. It's part of the complementarity, as Bohr said. The moment you say, well, I want to study culture as if there was no people there, and then I can make a description of the formal system, but it doesn't give any meaning. If culture want to discuss, you can get structural laws and what have you. That has been tried as well. So my take on sense of justice is that it is an ethical, emotional agreement shared by a larger or smaller cultural community, translating informal, invisible norms, because most of the people are not aware that the caste system is a very particular kind. It is just, how could that girl travel alone there? That's the immediate proto-spontaneous, because it's spontaneous, but because of the context, of course. Invisible norms into human action attached to human responsibility. That's all of a sense of justice when we accept what humans do, or we don't accept it. That's a basic thing we have. The sense of justice is historically contextualized and interacts with and underpins the formal legal system in the culture where it operates. And in this case of radical transgression, this interaction is broken. And the, that's the danger thing there. And the culture will have a difficulty by coping with events that challenge the relationship and interaction between the formal system and the sense of justice. And that's what we have with these kind of things. So that was about photos, cultural encounters, and cultural conflicts. And now I will come to some of the basic notions here, because what I'm talking about is what psychologists call coping, namely the capacity to find ways in which we can integrate traumatic experience, collective or individual, in our ordinary life. And we, as I said to Robert in the break here, unfortunately we don't have a Danish word for that. When I try to explain that in Danish, I have to do various things. And I ask Danish psychologists, what do you do when you talk to patients with individual traumatic kind of experience? Oh, I use the word coping. I don't have anything else. So it has been a term kind of decontextualized from its theoretical background, and then, as many scientific terms, they travel between disciplines and so on and so forth. But it's very important that throughout history, and I think that goes across cultures, there are two types of coping. We can cope by retribution, and that's the old retaliation system, an eye for an eye, as we heard the other day here. And that's a way of coping, because the basic idea behind that is, of course, that we pay back and we redress a past balance disturbed by a wrongdoing. So retribution is an essential part of sense of justice. And that's one of the mistakes of some of those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. They want to take retribution out because that is revenge, that's all these kind of things. But no sense of justice I know of, if you can describe different types, can live without a sense of retribution, that justice has happened. Otherwise, it's not acceptable. It cannot be the whole thing, but it's very important. And of course, in the case of the Korean hostages coming back, they had to make a public excuse. And that was a mild kind of retribution because they were forced to pay back by humiliating themselves, losing face in public themselves, which is very terrible. If we go to traditional Japanese culture, it's even worse. I mean. And the other type of coping we have is the coping by reconciliation. And the major thing with reconciliation is two things in contrast to retribution is that retribution exists within the context of the event itself. When it happens in this context, then you have to pay back. If the old Icelandic sagas with the family feuds, I mean, if I kill your son, then I can expect sooner or later you will kill my son. So it's in the same closed system that retribution takes place. Reconciliation is something different, much more radical. That relies on a capacity to recontextualize the event, move it from one context to another so we can look upon it with new eyes, with new values, from new viewpoints and so on. And that is, of course, a very, very difficult process. In the Iranian case, this is quite clear, no recontextualization took place. In the Turkish case, it's much more ambiguous, of course, and the Korean case, it's clear that there was no recontextualization. They were put into the traditional context of the sense of justice predominant in a Korean society, in the public culture. And the second thing, which is a important thing, is that by recontextualization, we don't solve the problem. When we open a stage where negotiations are made, what are we now going to do to cope with that? Because you have to revision your value systems, your point of views, and so on. And that means that reconciliation is oriented towards the future. How can we do that so that we can live on? Whereas retribution is looking to the past, kind of recreating a balances which were there before. As we know from literature, and that's why I'm interested in literature, of course, is even when retribution has been made in various novels, literature is always there to find out, no, it didn't happen, so it goes on. I mean, this kind of vicious circle of processes of revenge and so on goes on here. But it's important that when we cross cultures, the concrete ways of coping, the coping strategies, I will say, are very, very different. It may be religious sacrifices, it may be prayer, it may be a verdict in the legal system, it may be being ousted from society, being an outcast, it may be reconciliation, it may be compensation, it may be retaliation. There are all kinds of ways in which coping takes place. That reconciliation has this quality that is oriented to an imagination of a changed future. And it's clear that the cultures in which radical transgression has taken place, that is, challenging all three levels I mentioned here, there may be other levels, but the entire value systems, interacting value systems, there, of course, the old question of how can we go into the future in those conditions is a basic question, and that was the genius of Desmond Tutu in South Africa, whatever, we may come back to that in the discussion, he had a firm eye on the future. You have to have a radical new way of dealing with things in order to cope with that. So what I will be doing in the following here is that I have this general definition of coping as reconciliation, and then I will go into forgiveness and tell you why I take that notion up here. First of all, it has to be deliberate. Otherwise, it cannot be recognized collectively, and otherwise it cannot be repeated. Because if you reconcile and say, well, I hate you still, but now it's done with, it doesn't work. You have to be able to repeat it. And I guess people who are working with individual clients in traumatic situations always have you have to work with the patient so the patients can repeat the good move in the future and so on. So that's an important thing. Individual or collective cultural act of coping with radical wrongdoing that draws on the power and what I call media imagination. You have to have imagination because you have to look into a future you have not known before. You cannot just go back. And when I talk about media of imagination here, of course, I think literature is one such thing, but many of the media, we have to make scenarios of things which have not yet happened. And that's why we will come back to language is so important, because language is the medium we all have in which we cannot avoid speaking about the future. All other, look, when a movie wants to show you something about the future visually, it's very, very difficult. But in language, it's so easy. Next year, I will go to the moon if I win in the lottery. I mean, you can easily construct sentences like that and so on. And next year, holiday, we can discuss it around the dinner table. It's a basic linguistic function that we can speak about the future, or rather, we cannot avoid speaking about the future. It's built into grammar, it's built into discourse and everything. So the media of imagination are those media with which we can articulate a future which we can locate in time and space, not just fancy places, but in time and space. And that's why narratives are so extremely important. By doing so, it recontextualizes radical wrongdoing and thereby offers a possibility of a shared working of emotions and memories related to event. The important thing is that reconciliation has nothing to do with forgetting. It's about having the memories in another mode. And it has to be shared. That's why media are so important, because if we are able to formulate something in language, that is the language we share with others. So possibility for negotiation and sharing is important. It's not just me who inside myself silently do that. So that's part of it. And there are various strategies for that. Now, look, now we come to forgiveness. My reasons for taking that up are several. First of all, forgiveness has been used as a universal term in many of those Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And it has been used through colonization, where the Christian missionaries has spread out, and some of the principles around forgiveness and reconciliation has been built into the formal law systems, like the 18th century conception of the law is also used to re-educate the population. I mean, that here it comes, not necessarily punish it, but also re-educate it. So what I want is to take forgiveness out of that universalizing context, because it's created in a particular European context, which I will show you the contradictions of in a little while, and place it in the broader context of coping. So it becomes a special case of coping, which may be useful, may have to work with others, but in all cultures where we have a sense of justice, which is not based, like the Korean case with honor and shame, based on the Christian values of forgiveness and reconciliation and so on, there it's very difficult to say this is what you want to do, because it will not be accepted. So you have to be able not to use forgiveness as a universal concept, but to use it as a platform for negotiating with different local senses of justice, if you can use the word senses of justice in the plural, I don't know. So transforming it from a universal preaching of Christian origin to an instrument for local negotiations in the context of other coping strategies. That's important. Some anthropologists has worked in Africa after Rwanda and so on with small local communities in order to have this process going on, using it as an instrument, not as the preaching of a universal principle. And then also to transform it from a metaphysical principle based on religion and the universality built into the Christian claim, which, I mean, that was the figure you had here. Moving it from up there, down there. How can we integrate that? I will not comment here on the South African case, but it was one of the fantastic movements when you read the report. Man, the results have been very doubtful, particularly in terms of economy, but the way that Desmond Tutu built up this notion of a reconciliation that was a masterful negotiation with local sense of justice with a principle of reconciliation, which large number of the faithful in South Africa could understand. So that was a negotiation. And finally, and that will be the last part of my paper, de-universalize it by insisting on its past and present historical context. Often it's taken out of its context and becomes a dogmatic principle. But what is its context? And if the context is, as I said in the beginning, part of a culture, on the limits of a culture, then this context will relieve some of the contradictions in the notions, which opens it for being de-universalized and be used as a tool in a negotiation. And that I will show you in a little while. The present historical context will be the novel I will be talking about here. So here we first have a set of ways in which it has been used and presented. Some of those will be new for you, some of them not. First of all, the uniqueness according to Christian faith and the Christian dogmas is that forgiveness in the Christian context is unconditional. Forgive them because they don't know what they are doing. And that means, which is the big contradiction, basically repentance is not required. You are a child of God, and by being that, you are forgiven. Which, of course, gives a bit headache if you want to have a Christian ethics based on choice between good and bad, and the Christian church has never solved that issue. They have, in the Catholic Church, you have confession as a kind of in between. You don't have that in the Protestant Church. There we have different things to that. But the basic problem here is when you read the Gospels, and St. Paul in particular, you can see it's contradictory, because some will go to hell. They have done unforgivable things, so they cannot be forgiven, not even by God. I mean, that's and if you go through the Gospels, you will see that St. John doesn't speak of forgiveness at all. He talks about witnessing, which is the variation of repentance. And in St. Matthew and Luke, you have lots about forgiveness, and St. Mark is in between here. And some of the issues of the complexity of a notion is in the stories which Jesus tells, the fables. So it's a very complex issue which is not at all as clear as is preached by the church. And it's that preaching which has gone universal. It's not the contradictions. And then the second thing, which is basic here, it's universal. It's for everyone. And that was one of the big challenges if you read the Gospels, namely that you don't have to convert to Christianity because you are a child of God anyway, you just happen not to know it. So that's so it's universal. It's not bound to the hierarchies of the laws according to the Old Testament and according to Judaism. And that's, of course, a big challenge, which is behind the forceful politics of mission. It's for everybody. And if you don't want to listen, I will tell you. But basically, it's formulated in such a way, it should be like Buddhism. If you want, fine. And if you don't, that's fine too for Buddhism. We don't. But so there's an intricate relationship here where the power relation in the Jewish society, according to the law, is kind of translated into the mission statement of Christianity. And then one of the things which is that forgiveness is not about forgetting. It's not an easy glossing over. It's about remembering, but remembering in another way, in such a way that you can integrate it in your personality. And I think I have to add here, I forgot that in the beginning, we had the term eudaimonia. I think it was Robert, you had it, about the ethically good life. There's another translation of eudaimonia which I think is better, and that's called eudaimonia, means happiness as a full life. Meaning that, according to the Greek thinking, where you don't have one God, but a multiplicity of gods, meaning that whatever you do, you will always be in trouble. If you go for that God, there will be more gods that will be against you, and that's what the epics are about, and that's what the tragedies are about, because human beings are of the particular kind, according to the tragedies, that we cannot avoid to overstep the limits of humanity. Prometheus taking the fire and so on and so forth. So we cannot avoid offending the gods. So therefore, the big thing with eudaimonia is not to be human, That is to be able to live with the consequences, cope with the consequences of our overstepping the line, and have been in a situation where you can unfold your potential for coping with transgressions is a part of eudaimonia and part of a moral life. It's Martha Nussbaum who has translated it as full life, to take in the problems we cannot avoid and the problems that might arise. The modern word happiness in Denmark, Danish people being the most happy in the world, it has nothing to do with eudaimonia, I'm afraid. It's about having social welfare system, money enough, and so on and so forth. But so forgiveness is part of that thinking. And then the fourth point, which is also important, forgiveness has to be a speech act. Revenge can be silent, forgiveness cannot. You don't know it, but I hate you, but inside myself I don't talk about it, I have forgiven you. That doesn't work. It has to be a speech act. It has to be a speech act, and in that regard it reminds, it's parallel, and that's why these Truth and Reconciliation Commissions can work. It's like a verdict, which has to be verbal too. But the big difference is the fourth point, namely that a verdict is a one-off. You may appeal it, but then it's over. Whereas the verbal act of forgiveness is often formulated indirectly and so on, so it's the beginning of a process. If you're not willing to forgive tomorrow, it's worth nothing. So this processual nature is part of also the teaching of Christ. He said, how many times shall I forgive my enemy? That's in St. Matthew. 7 times? No. 7 times 7, meaning always. I mean, so it's a process you start. It's not a result or an event. So those are, some of them are special and so on. But now, in the last part of my talk, I will look into the historical context where forgiveness was created. And it was created in two, so to speak, different contexts. So in itself, it is negotiation with two different contexts. And that contradiction is to be found in the Gospels, particularly in the Gospels and St. John, because that's where it's discussed. First of all, it was in the context of Judaism, based on the law, based on hierarchies, and the notion of forgiveness came in as a way of dealing with transgression outside the law. And so it was against this legalistic hierarchical dogmatism based on the covenant, and that's why it was so, the Jews was against. So there was clearly historical situation about having a universal principle for everybody, also those who was not converted. I mean, in St. Paul in particular, this is discussed. So that was one context, that it was against an existing strict hierarchy. It was not just something which come out of the head, we want a universal principle. That was, in that context, it became so significant. The second has to do with the problem of language, which we just talked about before, because the Gospels and St. Paul writes in Greek. That was a language that carried a pagan culture. And that was a culture where you didn't have that notion of forgiveness as it's just given. What did they have? They had the same thing as you have in all hierarchical cultures, and that's just like gift giving, is part of a power play. Because you have a pardon, which is something different, which is a manifestation of power, say like every time there's a president elected in France or in the States, he can pardon somebody. Demonstrate, I'm untouchable, I can pardon some of my enemies, they can go out of prison and so on. And that's a sign of the magnanimity, the forbearance of the powerful. But the subjects cannot pardon the king. This is absurd. I mean, the slave cannot pardon his or her masters. That's absurd. And that's exactly what Christian forgiveness is about. Everybody is equal in front of the requirement for forgiveness. So the Greek culture had, bound up as it was to a culture of honor and shame, was bound to a hierarchy where it was top down we had to do with here. And that's entirely different. How on earth are you going to use that language where you don't have a word, but have to imagine a future where a different type of coping strategies, different type of coping strategies, and you use metaphors. And two types of metaphors are used in St. Paul. It's from economy. Charizomai, that means to remit a debt. You're remitted. You don't have to pay back. Remittance without return. And in the Gospels, that hardly uses that term. There it's aphesis, and the word we have in apologize, an apology in English, named apoluo, which means set free. Apo is a prefix that set free, really set free. I mean, it's a kind of underlying. So it's set free physically from prison or something, or legally without punishment. So the interesting thing is here that the metaphors used, and those became terms. Aphesis is the term for forgiveness in Greek and in Christian, by the church. They are metaphors which belongs to the tributative register, and they are negated. You are remitted without paying back. You are released without being punished. But there are no positive formulation of what is forgiveness really. There's no positive term, but a negated metaphor from the other register of reconciliation, namely retribution. And that's why it's such an open notion that it's still, if you are reminded of those contradictions in the Christian context, reveals that is really a notion you can use for negotiation and redefinitions and recontextualization, but it has not been used like that by the church. So my last point will be a brief reading in the present context of a Korean novel called An Appointment with My Brother. It's a very interesting little novel. I have read it in English translation, and there are some, I have asked a colleague who said, well, there's something added to it in the translation to explain things for the English reader, and that's a very important point, of course, because some of those honor and shame-related things will be immediately understandable within the sense of justice in Korea, but not for a English-reading public necessarily. Here we have the picture of those again. So, let me say, I'm going to start. The novel is about two brothers, Yi Yeon-sup from Seoul and Yi Hyuk from the north. So it's about a divided country where you may have a Korean culture, but now it's overdetermined by communism on the one hand, by capitalism in the south, by atheism or secular state in the north, and by a secular state in the south, but with lots of communities of various sorts, mainly Buddhist and in the kind of Western variant of Buddhism, and quite a lot of Catholics and some Presbyterians and so on in Seoul here. What we hear from them is a very interesting story, because the occasion why they meet is that their father is dead. The father has fathered the narrator in the south, and he was probably during the war doing things which made him flee, probably communist. He fled to the north after the war, or during the, it's not after the war, it's still a pending war, fled to the north. And there he remarried and had new children. So the whole issue of the traditional family structure is involved here. So he broke out of the family, basically deceived the family, which is unforgivable according to the local sense of justice. Whereas in other cultures it might be a practical arrangement, but what else should he do? So the brother in the south, who is the oldest, feels deceived. But he also has the obligation, now the father is dead, to say the final words, which is the oldest son, and make some sacrifices with spirit from the hometown in the south. There's a small Genji Korean enclave in the northern of China, and there they can meet on neutral grounds. So this brother is permitted to travel out, and from the south he goes through China, and up there they meet, and they look towards the south and do the sacrifices. And then they start to talk to each other. And both of them had the most spectacular life. In the north, my father was a hero, and we have been rich. I am doing this. And in the south, of course, we are rich, we have been doing well, and so on. The thing is, of course, that we can see through the lines that the brothers really do not tell each other what is going on here. The basic perpetrator for both of them is the father. And they can't kind of talk to each other without going through the father, forgive the father, or recontextualize the act. the thing is that both of them have the family name, which is supposed to be an important family in Korea. And it turns out that the children have been giving the family name and family first names in the family and so on. So beneath the official cultures they live in, they have a shared sense of justice, which is the basis for them to negotiate. Now, what happens then is that there are other sidelines of the story, but what happens then is they get completely plastered one night. And that helps a lot, as we all know, when you have to confess. And finally, we see that the brother in the south is rich, okay, but he has been in the gray zones of capitalism and speculated and so on and so forth. And the brother in the north has lived in a very poor family. The father, coming from the south, never got anywhere because he was, they thought he was a spy, of course, so he didn't do anything. And finally, they can talk to each other without losing face. So they kind of go through. And suddenly, it's not contextualized in the past. It becomes contextualized to the present level of the family between the brothers without the father. And here we then have the big problem in that they have to go through, and which the Hoshides also had to go through. And here it's a story about some of the Japanese perpetrators in Korea and China after the war, who could not go back and tell about their stories because that would be forcing the community to lose face. So they had to keep everything in silence. It's an American philosopher and anthropologist who interviewed some of the perpetrators from Japan very lately here. But this is basically the logic of how the two brothers speak to each other until they get a little too much to drink. And then, before they depart, they need to forgive each other because of the father, because it's unforgivable has happened in the family. So they are victims of it, but they have to translate it or recontextualize it from the burial of the father and animosity toward the father to the wish to build up a relationship with themselves. But they can't say, "I forgive you," because forgive, what have I done wrong? So it has to be indirect. And here we have it. Please give my love to my brothers and sisters. Then I added, like one who has made a grave decision. This is really serious stuff. And our mother. So it means that now they accept they have two mothers, which is an impossible thing. So our mother are both mothers. One of my anxious uncertainties I decided to meet my brother was how to call my brother's mother. Should I call her mother in the north or my stepmother? But she became our mother in my mind at the moment of parting from my brother. In Asian order, this is put in the translation. They have to explain something here. And the narrator says, to my modern rational sensibility, of course, he's living in another world, and I was surprised that our mother rolled out of my mouth so naturally and started. My brother was visibly affected too, his alcohol-clouded face sobering up at once. And then he says, please give my love to my sister, my nephews and nieces, and to our mother too. So this shared use of the word other mother works as I forgive you. But that's the way it can work as a negotiation on the local conditions here. And that's it.
That was most fascinating. I was warned, sorry, that we have to keep now the coffee break.
Yeah.
Can we, anybody who has questions to Svend Erik, raise the question during the coffee break?
Yeah.
And then, of course, at the dinner, we will discuss.
Yeah, it's fine.
Sorry
Yeah. You should have stopped me, but I'm like Ernst. I mean, if nobody stops us, I mean, that's we have been living for that for years. I mean, yeah. Oh, thank you.